Okay, right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for bearing with us for those few minutes. Welcome to everybody who's joined us for this Social Farms and Gardens webinar. I know we've got a lot of you on the call and we've got people from all over the country. So people joining from Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales and England. So that's wonderful. Today's session is all about, we called it risk, insurance and liability, and this is part of a series of webinars that we've been running for several weeks now on issues that members are experiencing because of COVID-19 and all the difficulties that are going on, we see, globally to do with that. I think we've got some people who might have joined us from other networks as well, so welcome to you. If you don't know too much about Social Farms and Gardens, we're a national charity. We've been going for about 40 years. In fact, this year is our birthday, but we had to cancel our birthday party. Yeah, we support a really wide range of about 1,700 members all over the UK who do amazing work connecting people with nature and the land and bringing their communities together around activities there. So I'm just going to run through a few quick housekeeping bits and then I'm going to shut up and I'm going to hand over to our partners today. So we're really grateful that we've got on the line Johnny from McClarrons Insurance. Hey Johnny, and Ronan from Radar Legal, and I'll let them introduce themselves as we go through, and we are going to have lots of time at the end for questions. So I know lots of people will have questions, so you can either send them through during the session or sort of add them in at the end, but we will get to questions. Okay, so just see if I can skip through. Gone too far. Okay, so just quick housekeeping. Just so you know, all attendees are muted and your video is off. So it just keeps things nice and sort of calm and orderly, but it does mean that we can't see or hear you. So we just trust that you're there. If you've got questions during the webinar, as I said, please use the Q&A function. It's just going to be me kind of behind the scenes, keeping an eye on questions. So please use that function if you want to speak to me or if you're having a technical issue. There's also a chat function. So please do use that to sort of speak to each other, to speak to everybody else, share ideas or links. I'm going to try and keep an eye on that, but if there's lots of questions, I might not be able to. So if you've got questions for participants, please use the Q&A function. We are recording the webinar as well, and we will put it online on our website after the session. So if there's any bits that you want to revisit, then you'll be able to, or if people miss it, then they can catch up. And if you leave the webinar without meaning to, if your internet goes down, then you should just be able to rejoin using the same link. So yes, that should all work okay. Okay, right, well that's all the housekeeping from me, so I'm going to take off my screen and hand over to Johnny to introduce himself.
Thank you, Sophie. Let me just get the slides up. Okay, so hopefully those have come up for everyone and they can see those. Yeah, excellent. Okay. So today we're here to talk about risk management, insurance and liability coming out of COVID-19. I just want to briefly introduce myself. So I'm Jonathan Copley. I'm head of care and social welfare at McClarrons Insurance Brokers. We're an independent insurance broker established 30 years ago. The independence is really, really important because it means we are not ultimately owned by an insurer or some huge national corporate or anything of that nature. It means we represent our clients and we work with our clients on insurance solutions for their very bespoke risks. We work in a number of niche areas. So we're specialists in rural and farm, care and charity, commercial, property and affinity. And to wrap that all up, we have an in-house claims team as well. So when the worst does happen, we don't just palm you off with an insurance hotline number. We've got a claims team to take you through it. I just wanted to explain really why McClarrons have invited Radar Legal to join us on the call. Radar Legal are a law firm, but not as you traditionally know it. They are specialist litigators and a commercial law firm, and they are very much there to help educate their clients using their legal expertise with digital tools, and are there for proactive rather than reactive results. We are partnering with Radar Legal on one of our products, Raw Protect, which essentially picks up what we call management liability, or more trustee protection. And Radar offer their legal services through that policy. Some of you, if you have taken out a policy with McClarrons, will no doubt have access to Radar already, and will be well versed in their expertise and the access to the various tools that they give you. So first of all, I just thought it'd be useful to start off with some terminology from some of the feedback we've had from members, just to help the flow of these conversations we're going to have. So the first one is broker, which is really representing McClarrons and who and what we are. So essentially, we arrange transactions between buyers, and sellers. So you come to McClarrons, we access the insurance market that's appropriate for your needs, and we sell you a policy if you are happy with it. When we're talking about risk, we're talking about the possibility or chance of a loss or danger to injuries. In the insurance world, we talk a lot about perils. So peril is specific risk or cause of a loss, which an insurance policy will cover, such as a fire, storm or flood or theft or something of that nature. And coupled with that, we talk a lot about hazards, which are, a factor or an activity that exacerbate the loss. So I'll put an example on there of, if there was some gasoline left outside a house, essentially that's going to make the hazard, that's going to be a hazard which makes the peril more likely to occur and could in fact make it worse. Liability, essentially someone is legally responsible for something. When we're talking about duty of care, we're talking about your moral or legal obligation to ensure the safety and well-being of others. Due diligence, which I know will come up a lot in this conversation. We're looking at the sort of reasonable steps you can take as an organisation or individual to look at that decision-making process. Policy process and procedure. We're looking at actions adopted or proposed by your organisation or individuals within it in terms of policy. Process, the series of actions or steps that you take in order to achieve a particular end, and procedure, an established or official way of doing something. So what have you put in place since then, and how are you recording it? Now, coupled with the terminology, we've put this process map together, which is available for download on the Social Farms and Gardens website and has been for a little while now. Just to help members make decisions on what insurance they might be looking for. So if we start at the top, it takes you through public liability and maybe why you should consider that. And you kind of just follow the series of questions down in yes or no format to give you an idea of maybe what covers you might want to consider. Obviously, if you're a charity, you might have a board of trustees who this may be a useful document for, or as a new startup as well. So like I say, it's already available for download and you can access this through the Social Farms and Gardens websites. Okay, and whilst we're here to talk about potentially reopening, I think it's important to mention there's a lot of people out there who are remaining closed and who've taken that decision. And there are impacts with COVID to remaining closed as well, believe it or not. In the insurance world, we're talking about an increased risk of theft and malicious damage if you are insuring property or buildings on site. There's a couple of things to run through here and just point out with insurance policies and how they work in the event of a claim. We have had a number of members come to us who've had issues getting claims paid previously with theft or malicious damage to property. So some of the main things to look out for is policies will normally have a condition which require forceful or violent entry or exit to the building for theft to be covered under the policy. Now, we are aware that's extremely different for some of you, with buildings which are out in the open, tools which can be stored outside. So it is something to be mindful of if you are locking down your site because you're remaining closed. Alarm conditions. So if you have an alarm condition on your policy, making sure that that alarm is set to obviously sound off in the event of a claim, because the insurer will be looking for the fact that it has been set. Minimum standards of security. Now, this comes up a lot. Each insurer will have a minimum standard which they're looking for. So if there is a claim in terms of a theft, what they're looking for is for that minimum security to be in place. And if it is not, then obviously there's going to be the claim is going to be problematic. So we very much recommend you check your policy and see what that is, and just see if you can comply with that, or if you need to maybe lock things up in different buildings that do comply with that policy. Insurance ultimately provides new for old cover. So if an item is 10 years old, you still need to insure it for a modern day equivalent, which I know can be tricky, but that is how the insurance is designed. Donated equipment and goods comes up a lot, in that we find that people don't place any value on donated goods. But if we are insuring them, they need to have, again, a modern day equivalent replacement value if you are looking to insure it on your policy. Site security. So if you have been closed, we very much recommend that you do regular site visits, whether that's alone or with someone else in your household, and that you keep a record of this somewhere. The dates, when you went, if you noticed anything untoward, or a gap in security and what you put in place. We just find it's useful risk management, especially in the event of a claim, to show insurers. Unoccupancy conditions are again something that come up. If the site has been occupied for a certain number of days, the cover under the policy will normally reduce to fire, lightning, explosion and aircraft, and is not going to pick up that potential theft risk. So again, the length of an occupancy can differ between policy to policy. So we very much recommend you check with your broker or your insurer just to get their stance and so you fully understand it. And coupled to that, the insurance response to COVID-19 is that they have extended their policies in a number of areas. So in some cases, they have completely gotten rid of the unoccupancy condition up until a certain date in time, which means that full cover will remain in force. Again, these extensions to cover can differ from policy to policy, so we very much recommend you check with your broker or insurer to see if you are remaining closed, you know, is that extension of cover applying to you, or are you closed past the date on the policy? Other things we've started to see are COVID-19 exclusions on policies as well. A couple of insurers have done that on liabilities, but not many. If you have got a COVID-19 exclusion on your policy, again, take a look at it, speak to your broker and make sure you fully understand it, just to see where you are and are not covered under the policy. It can affect trustee indemnity. Like we say, it can affect your liabilities, but that is in the minority at the moment. We haven't seen too many insurers exclude it on the liability side of things, but have a look at it and just be clear if you do have one on there. And we've spoken a little bit about contents there and getting the sums insured right. We've put together an asset register, which again is available on the Social Farm and Garden website for download. This is really there for you guys to have a document you can fill in with all your equipment, maybe even your buildings or property, and you know, sheds, outbuildings, tools, mowers, and you can actually build that document. So in the event of a claim, you've done your due diligence. This is something you could hand to your broker or to insurer that will help and assist with that claim going through. So I hope you find it useful, and again, it is available on the website. Okay, we feel the big things with this conversation are probably going to be around your liabilities. So when you do reopen, how is COVID going to affect your public liability and employers' liability? So before we dive into that, it's just important to understand exactly what that is. So public liability, we're looking at covering the cost of legal action and compensation if a claim is made against your business or your organisation by a third party, if they are injured or suffer their own property damage whilst on your premises. Okay. Now, it's important to also say that there are extensions of cover, especially on the care farming community. If you are working with vulnerable people, some policies contain abuse liability, which is unfortunately the really nasty end of the business. So if there was an allegation of abuse, it would extend to pick that up. Treatment liability, we've worked with a couple of members who do have CQC registration and might be involved in admin or prompting medication. And high-risk liability as well, which is if you are bringing third parties onto your site to run, I mean, we've seen all kinds of things with yoga or different therapies. It's making sure that the third party has relevant insurance in place. However, if that insurance fails, making sure that, and if their insurance fails, sorry, and the claim then comes against you, it's looking at that potential gap in coverage and filling that void. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about public liability. Employers' liability is the side of it. So we're looking at your employees or volunteers. So this is compulsory. So if you are employing someone and paying them, then you will need the employer's liability in place. Okay. So we're looking at the cover for any sum which you as the employer are liable to pay to any employees if they sustain an injury, disease, which is key, illness or death caused during employment in their role with you in the business. Okay, and I thought this was quite interesting because not many people know exactly who might be classed as an employee. We talk about paid staff, we talk about trustees, we talk about volunteers, but actually a lot of people coming onto your site could be classed as an employee. If they're under your supervision, so your organisation's supervision and control, you are directing them, then they could, in fact, in an injury, be classed as an employee. So we're talking about labourers, subcontractors, people who are self-employed, who are on site, who might not be in partnership or part of you as a policyholder. If you're hiring staff or you are using a recruitment agency for temporary staff, if you're interviewing people who aren't an employee yet, all these people potentially in the right claim scenario could be classed as an employee. Okay, so COVID-19 and liability insurance. If you are reopening now at the moment, we're going to be passing on to Radar in a minute, who are going to talk about some of the legalities and the risk assessments and that side of things, and health and safety. What we're just advising at the moment is looking at how to protect your staff in the first place. So consideration to volunteers, members of the public, and how many people to have on site, taking the social distancing rules into account. So the site capacity there. We've seen some members do an online booking system to try and mitigate that risk. Communicating your policies and procedures with COVID-19 and social distancing, you know, how is that message being come across to people attending on site? Is it on the website? Have you put up signs? If you're working with vulnerable people, or if vulnerable people are attending, you know, is PPE available? Key workers and vulnerable individuals, you know, have you asked your own staff members, you know, because it's bigger than just your employees. If your employee is maybe married to someone who is a key worker, how does that affect people? Because sometimes people need protecting from themselves, and it's down to the leadership as you as the employer, and it's just something to consider. What we're looking at with COVID is really there needs to be evidence that there's been some negligence on your part, which could have led to this person, you know, potentially getting COVID or unfortunately passing away, you know, worst case scenario with COVID. So there needs to be an evidence trail. And what we're really looking at there is, you know, what evidence can you supply as an organisation that an insurer would want to put a robust defence in place? And again, just to be aware of any COVID liability exclusions. They're few and far between at present, but it is just worth checking your policy. So just before I hand over to Radar, what I will say is if you do want to contact the McClarrons Care and Charity team for any advice, if you don't want to put a question online and you want to take it offline and contact us, please feel free. Our number is on the slides. We're more than happy to help. Even if you're not a client of ours, please ring, we'll give advice and we will help. Okay. Okay, so I will hand over now to Ronan of Radar Legal, who will pick things up.
Thanks, Johnny. That's great. And I should have said at the start of this that we will be making slides available. Somebody had asked in the Q&A. So just so everybody knows, we will send slides around afterwards. Right. Over to Ronan.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophie and Johnny. Good morning, everybody. I will share slides in just a second. Sophie, is it possible to unmute Peter? Otherwise we may have to use, we have a few technology, there we go. Are you receiving, Peter?
I am, yes, if you can hear me.
And we can see him. Fantastic. Okay, excuse me. Okay, I'm just going to share slides now. There we go. So, as I said, good morning. I'm Ronan Ball, Business Development Manager at Radar, joined by my colleague Peter. We'll get to introductions and what we're going to cover in just a second. So that's us. So I'm here really to give you a little bit of background to Radar and the services that we provide under the umbrella of the legal teams. And Peter's going to talk you through some of the nitty-gritty around keeping safe, the sort of topics we looked at in preparation for this, sanitation, issues around PPE, which Johnny talked about, and essentially how to protect staff and visitors and what you need to do, measures you should be considering as we come through more sort of different rules and regulations and businesses trying to get up and running or staying closed, how to maintain that. So a little bit about Radar. So we are an independent law firm specializing in litigation, commercial law, and we do use a lot of technology to help bring legal risk management support to businesses in different ways. So I work out of Hull, but 4 offices, a growing business, been around for a few years now, and work alongside McClarrons and others. We'll talk a little bit about the insurance product in a bit. So that's a little bit about Radar. And the teams, so when people on the back of everything I described, it comes on the back of the insurance product, but the teams are able to advise and support businesses like yourselves, business crime and regulation, so any regulator that might be involved in overseeing your activities, whether that's health and safety, environment, local authority, anytime issues happen with those and they carry out inspections, then we can support on that, we can advise on that, commercial disputes that you might be involved with, corporate and commercial, the sort of chunkier legal challenges that you might face, a lot around data, cyber, GDPR compliance. We also see, depending on the nature of your business, subject access requests, freedom of information issues, and information commission. If data is lost or breached, then we help a lot of clients through those really challenging issues to prepare for the information commissioner inquiries. And HR and employment issues around discrimination, equal pay, all the sort of issues that you see around the whole employment issue. So we have teams working in all these areas able to support our clients. I'm going to hand over to Peter, give a little introduction. I'm sure Peter's going to take you through the next few slides, which will really take us into the detail of today's session. So Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Ronan. Okay. What I'm going to be looking at today is I'm going to be looking at what you should be considering in your risk assessments. I'll also give you an idea of what the HSE will be looking for, and how you can best protect yourselves against any kind of visit from the HSE or any kind of scrutiny by any kind of a regulatory body, essentially. Later, when I've looked at that, obviously I'm going to give you non-exhaustive things that you really should be considering as part of your risk assessment. I think one thing I should stress is that don't think that you've got to implement absolutely every single thing that I am suggesting. These are just what I'm more want to do is I want to give you an idea of the kind of things you should be looking into, and most importantly, not only should you be looking into them, you should also be keeping a record of the fact that you've considered these things, so that you can provide evidence to the HSE or whoever the regulator may be that you've at least thought about these measures. So even if you don't apply them, it's good to be in a position whereby you can say, we looked at it, we decided we didn't want to implement it for such and such a reason, and that's why we decided not to do that, or preferably we decided not to do that, but we decided to do this instead. That's the key. It's to be able to demonstrate that you've considered taking these measures, or that you've at least thought about them. You need to take all reasonable measures to introduce work practices that ensure 2 meters of physical distance between workers. Obviously, as of the 4th of July, that's going to change to the 1 meter plus, and I'll go into more detail about that later on. Where the social distancing guidelines can't be followed and the work is essential, you need to be in a position whereby you take action to reduce the risk of the transmission between staff, volunteers and visitors. And as I said before, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've taken steps to mitigate that risk. So what can you do to mitigate the risk? Well, the first thing you can do is you can look at how you assign tasks. An example of this, you could assign one person for a particular work area. You can reduce the number of people in a work area. You can keep people to shift teams so that they're not always working together at the same time. Ronan, if you could just move to the next slide for me. It's just, I just thought it'd be easier if I could walk you through that. I think it makes it easier to refer to. Similarly, you can reduce the number of people each person has contact with by using fixed teams or partnering. So you'd have each person working with only a few other people, which can obviously lessen the risk significantly. If possible, you may want to consider allocating things such as machinery, vehicles or equipment to one worker, or at least find a way for it to be used by as few workers as possible. Now, as I stated earlier, you must implement social distancing. This is something that regulatory bodies are going to be pretty hot on, because I think it's obviously become very clear that the closer you are to someone for an extended period of time, the risks of contracting it go up exponentially. So obviously the reduction from 2 meters to 1 meter has been controversial, because I think I saw a study that says that the risks go up 9 or 10 times if you reduce it from 2 meters to 1 meter, which is why they're bringing in this 1 meter plus. So at the moment, you must, where possible, keep workers a minimum of 2 meters apart. But on the 4th of July, that is going to change to 1 meter plus. So that means that if workers cannot stay 2 meters apart, they must be kept at least 1 meter apart, and steps have to be taken to minimize the risks of transmission. And the extra measure you take to reduce the risk is a matter for you, and I can give some examples of them, but essentially you just need to be able to demonstrate that you've thought about this and you've introduced something additional to minimize the risk. Now, I understand at least one of our listeners is from Northern Ireland, I actually did a little bit of research just prior to coming on the air. And my understanding, and I'm going off, I didn't have a lot of time to look into this, but I'm going off the BBC website. My understanding is this 1 metre plus actually came in to effect in Northern Ireland on Monday, on the 29th of June. So I believe that is already in place, but I've got to warn out, I haven't had a huge amount of time to look into that. So what are some of the things you can do as your kind of 1 metre plus if this is necessary? We know it's far more preferable for people to work side to side rather than face to face for pretty obvious reasons. So if people do need to be within 2 metres of one another, keep them side by side. Make sure they're not facing each other so that coughs obviously can't spread. If this is difficult to avoid, you may want to consider using screens or physical barriers to keep people apart. You want to limit the number of people in an enclosed space. You may want to consider measures such as staggering arrival and departure times from work. And you'll also want to reduce general congestion where you are. So that can be having more entry points, more exit points from the workplace. You'll also want to look at managing common areas. So you consider maybe staggering break times so that there's less pressure on break rooms or places to eat. If possible, if these break areas are indoors, you may want to consider keeping windows and doors open to improve ventilation, especially when it's hot. Obviously, that might not be possible if it's cold. Again, if weather permits, you might want to consider using outdoor areas for break periods. Likewise, you can reconfigure the seating and tables to make sure that you keep the 2 metre distance and preferably not allow people to be sitting face to face and side by side if possible. You'll also want to consider introducing access controls for toilet areas. So for example, you can introduce a 1 in, 1 out policy for restrooms, and you may want to consider putting notices outside the restrooms just so people know what the rules are. Again, it's really important that if you do implement any of these policies or procedures, you include reminders to staff and visitors. So that can be in the form of just signs around the workplace. I'll go into more detail later. You might want to actually give out some kind of a booklet or send an email just outlining the measures that you have in place. Because not only does it obviously help them follow the procedures when they're on the site, but it's also something you can give to the HSE if they were to give an inspection. You also want to look at how you manage volunteers and visitors. I know that a lot of the listeners to this webinar will hopefully be having a lot of visitors in the coming months. So this is something you're going to need to focus on. It's therefore very important that the site guidance and the social distancing measures that you do decide to put in place are explained to the visitors at or before arrival. So you may want to consider some kind of a document, a leaflet that you can hand to the visitor, preferably get them to sign it as well and take a copy, or you can email it to them beforehand just so that you can demonstrate that you've done everything you can to let the visitors know what the actual rules are. And again, if practical, it is a good practice to maintain a record of all visitors to the site. Ronan, if you could just go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Clear signage will be important. You want to ensure public notices are visible and help inform workers, customers, visitors, contractors, whoever they may be. And encourage people to maintain social distancing whilst on site. You want to provide signage at entrances to the work site. You want to provide signage on rights of way that cross your workplace to remind members of the public to maintain social distancing. The implementation of a cleaning regime is very important. Again, you want to encourage workers and visitors to increase the frequency of their hand washing and surface cleaning. You may want to consider providing hand washing facilities, or if that's not possible, hand sanitizers at entry and exit points. If staff have to share machinery, vehicles, equipment, then they should be required to wash their hands before and after using that equipment, and to make sure they don't touch their face whilst they're using the equipment, certainly before they manage to wash their hands after using the equipment. Again, you might want to introduce signs next to the machinery or equipment to remind the workers of this. And likewise, all the machinery, vehicles or equipment will need to be cleaned and disinfected regularly and always before another person uses it. Again, you might want to have reminders near the machinery. Excuse me. Workplaces will need to be cleaned more frequently. You want to pay close attention to objects that are handled frequently throughout the day. And you also want to clear workspaces and remove waste and belongings from the work area at the end of each working day. And it's also going back to before about how you might want to have a policy with toilets of one in, one out. It might be a good idea to provide workers and visitors with details as how they can sanitize the toilet area after using the facilities. You want to consider use of PPE. Now, PPE is a bit of a strange one. So, for example, on the gov.uk website, it says for non-health and social care settings, it says for other workers and sectors, based on current evidence, there is very little scientific evidence of widespread benefit from PPE. Instead, practicing good hand hygiene and social distancing is key to minimizing the risk of infection. Likewise, the HSE guidance currently says wearing a face covering is optional in most circumstances and is generally not required in workplaces. They are not an effective way to manage the risk from coronavirus, and you should not rely on them. However, they do accept later on that they may be marginally beneficial as a precautionary measure against coronavirus. Now, I think it's worth noting that the HSE sees PPE protection as masks and respirators, and when I say masks, I'm not talking about face coverings, I'm talking about proper masks with some kind of a filtration system. So where it says against coronavirus is generally only required for certain healthcare activities. In a non-clinical setting, there is no need to provide different PPE than you would normally have provided before the outbreak started. So as things stand right now, if your business is not involved in healthcare, which none of your businesses are, PPE is not required, unless for whatever reason there are any jobs that workers needed to use PPE for prior to that. So if they needed to use PPE prior to this, then obviously they should continue to do so, but they don't need to you don't need to specifically introduce PPE. However, there's been an increasing amount of research that appears to be suggesting that face coverings, whilst it doesn't protect you from getting COVID-19, it certainly reduces the chances of you giving it to someone else. And obviously, we now know that if you have to use public transport, you have to have a face covering. So certainly, whilst the HSE doesn't seem to have much faith in face-to-face coverings, certainly if you have a situation where you have workers working closer than 2 meters, I think it's definitely something that you want to consider. And crucially, the HSE guidance does say that if any of your employees does wish to wear face coverings, you should support them in doing that. So just make sure you bear that in mind. So you never want to be in a situation whereby a worker comes in and says, look, I want to wear a face covering, and you say, no, you can't do that, it's inappropriate for that job. That's when you could find yourself coming unstuck. Managing goods arriving and leaving. Again, you may want to consider revising the pickup, drop-off and collection points. If you do change any of these points, don't forget to put additional signage in place. Where possible, it might be preferable to have single workers load or unload vehicles, or barring that, if more than one person is needed, you may want to consider using the same workers to load and unload so that they can work in smaller teams and limit the amount of contact with other people. If you have delivery drivers who attend the site regularly, you might want to encourage them, if possible, to stay in their vehicles. You can either warn them beforehand or make sure you have signs close by to ask drivers to stay in their vehicles. Okay, so that's the end of the measures that, again, it's not an exhaustive list. I just want to give an idea of the things you should be considering. And the most important thing is that you evidence that you've considered these things. Now, legally, you do not have to do a written risk assessment if your company is under 5 employees. If there are under 5 people in the company, you don't have to do it. I still think it's a good idea. I still think if there were a situation where any regulator were to do an inspection, if you can prove in a document, whether that be a risk assessment, whether it be minutes of a meeting, some kind of proof that you've considered a lot of these factors, it'll stand you in very good stead. Right, what I'm going to look at next is rradar reporting. I know this is something that's caused quite a bit of confusion. I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure that the Health and Safety Executive particularly helped the matter. They've issued some guidance that has caused a little bit of confusion, so hopefully I'm going to try and clarify some of that. Right, according to the HSE's guidance regarding rradar reporting, I'm going to read what it says on their guidance. It says, there is no requirement under rradar to report incidents of disease or deaths of members of the public, patients, care home residents, or service users from COVID-19. The reporting requirements relating to cases of or deaths from COVID-19 under rradar only apply to occupational exposure. That is, as a result of a person's work. Okay. The guidance then lists 3 circumstances where you should report a case of COVID-19 under rradar. The first one is a dangerous occurrence, and that is an accident or incident at work that has or could have led to the release or escape of coronavirus. The second one is cases of disease, so that is where a person at work has been diagnosed as having COVID-19, and this is attributed to an occupational exposure to COVID-19. And the third one is a work-related death due to exposure to a biological agent. And this is when a worker dies as a result of occupational exposure to coronavirus. Now, the key thing here to remember is that the employee needs to have been exposed to the virus as a result of their occupation. Okay, that's the most important thing. It's not simply a case of an employee calls you and says, look, I've got symptoms, I'm self-isolating, and you immediately have to report that to the HSE. We've got to remember that this is a virus that's in the general population. You can't just assume that they've received it from the workplace. And just to go back, if there's anyone out there who doesn't know what rradar reporting is, I should probably briefly explain what that is. Essentially, under statute, if someone is injured, or if there's a near miss at work that meets certain criteria, you've got to report it to the Health and Safety Executive, and they will then make a decision as to whether or not to investigate. That's what rradar reporting is. So as I said, the key here is that the employee needs to have been exposed to the virus as a result of their occupation. So the question is, how do you know if it's as a result of their occupation? Now, the HSE has given some guidance on this, and the guidance is as follows. Now, the first one in relation to dangerous occurrences. It seems pretty clear from the guidance we have been given at the moment that this is directed at the healthcare sector. The reason we say that is because the examples given on the website have been a laboratory worker who accidentally smashes a vial of coronavirus on the floor, leading to people being exposed, or a sample of from a COVID-19 patient breaks in transit, leading to a spillage. So I don't see that applying to anyone who's listening to this webinar. So at the moment, it doesn't appear that dangerous occurrences is going to apply to anyone in this case. When it comes to cases of disease, that is something that could potentially apply to anyone. In this case, the HSE say that the employer must make a judgment based on the information available as to whether or not a confirmed diagnosis of COVID-19 is likely to have been caused by an occupational exposure. That is, whether or not there is a reasonable evidence that a work-related exposure is the likely cause of the disease. Likewise, with work-related deaths due to exposure to a biological agent, again, it says there must be reasonable evidence that a work-related exposure caused the worker's death. So the question is, how are you supposed to know if it's work-related? Now, there was some criticism, as I said, of the first set of guidance they put out. So they released further guidance, which unfortunately only seems to have muddied the waters further. But what they have done is they've given guidance as to what qualifies as reasonable evidence of occupational exposure. And it says as follows. When deciding if a report is required, the responsible person must make a judgment based on the information available as to whether or not a confirmed diagnosis of COVID-19 is likely to have been caused by occupational exposure. There must be reasonable evidence linking the nature of the person's work with an increased risk of becoming exposed to coronavirus. And factors to take into account, again, it's not an exhaustive list, include whether or not the nature of the person's work activities increase the risk of them being exposed, whether or not there was any specific identifiable incident that led to an increased risk of exposure, whether their work directly brought them into contact with a known coronavirus hazard without effective control measures, and also if a medical practitioner has highlighted the significance of work-related factors when communicating a diagnosis, these cases would be reportable also. So for example, if you had a worker who phoned in and said, I've been diagnosed with COVID-19, my doctor said I probably caught it when I was, when I was unloading this lorry and I was too close to, I came too close to someone else who had COVID-19. That's probably a situation where you should consider reporting it. So how far do you need to go in investigating this? Does it need to be a kind of forensic investigation? The answer is no, fortunately. It says responsible persons do not need to conduct extensive inquiries in seeking to determine whether a COVID-19 infection is work-related. The judgment should be made on the basis of the information available. There is no requirement for rradar reports to be submitted on a precautionary basis where there is no evidence to suggest that occupational exposure is the likely cause of an infection. So just to sum that up, there does need to be evidence that they have picked it up as a result of their employment activities. Obviously, if you have a situation where several employees fall ill at the same time, you know that they've been working together, again, you don't need to carry out a huge amount of investigating to realise that there's a real likelihood that it could have been as a result of workplace exposure. So that is a situation where you'd want to consider reporting it. Again, even if you report it, it does not mean that the HSE or a regulatory body is going to take any action against you. It just brings it to their attention, and there is a possibility you may get a visit from them. But as long as you follow the measures that I outlined earlier, hopefully it should leave you in a good position. Okay, I've spoken for quite a while there. Thanks a lot for listening to me today. I apologise if some of that was a bit dry, particularly the stuff about rradar reporting. And I'll now pass you back over to Ronan. He'll talk a bit more. I think he'll talk about the Rural Protect policy. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So just kind of to wrap up, a couple more slides. Everything we discuss in terms of the rradar services and how we work with Johnny and McClarrons under the Rural Protect policy. That's just to make, I suppose, that clear, that access to radar and what we provide, legally privileged advice. So Peter, example, one of our lawyers, conversations that clients have with our lawyers are protected with legal privilege and confidentiality, which leads to great open conversations, safe in the knowledge that it doesn't get disclosed to any regulator or third party without the solicitor's approval. There's a crisis line available. If a regulator turns up on your doorstep out of hours, then we can support that. We have a team of legal advisors who work, those are the hours that they're available, take, particularly at the moment, hundreds of calls on a daily basis, supporting clients with regulatory matters, employment, HR, business challenges. And online, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the online services that we provide and services like this, webinars and the like. So that's how we work in partnership under this insurance product. I talked a lot about the digital side of things. So in addition to the people, and Peter's given a really good example of how he works and supports, we also provide to our policyholders a web portal, thousands of articles, hundreds of templates, forms, checklists, risk assessment type forms and everything else on there to help policyholders. We have Grace, which is an app, legal assistant on the go, voice activated, ask it questions, it'll pull back short, succinct answers. And then finally we have Radar Report, which is a platform for reporting accidents and near misses. And also has built into it radar reporting capabilities. So if something serious does happen, a lawyer would help support the reporting of that incident through the app. So we have notifications coming through to Radar on that. So all of those digital services and the people services come under the banner of Radar proposition as part of that insurance offering. And that's really us. So thank you for listening. I'm going to hand back now to Sophie, and I'll stop sharing the screen.
Great. Thanks, Ronan, and Peter and Johnny, for all of that. There was so much content and information in there. It was really helpful. We have had lots of questions come in. I know Johnny's been beavering away behind the scenes answering some of them, so it might be worth having a look through and seeing which ones have already been answered. But there's been quite a number that I just wanted to start running through now, if that's okay with you all. We've got my colleague Lou from Scotland on the webinar. Hey Lou. And she had a member asking her yesterday around liability in local authority sites. So we have quite a number of members who will be running activities, some of whom on a really long-term basis, on local authority land. So there was a question around where that ultimate responsibility lies, and if there is sort of clear guidance on that around COVID particularly. We've heard that some local authorities are maybe a bit jumpy, and in some instances not happy that the Scottish Government particularly is giving the green light for groups to kind of start activities again on growing sites within the guidance, and just if there's anything that you could say on that.
Sure. I mean, I can pick up on some experience I've had. We've asked a number of insurers for some advice in similar situations. Insurers are typically sitting on the fence with it. The advice they will give is that the government's guidance should be followed, and usually that will supersede the local authority. It sounds like the local authority are going with it despite the grumbles. So from the insurance perspective, if the government has said yes, you know, carry on, open the site, then the policy should be in place to react. But again, like I've said to a few of the members, you know, I can give you the advice from my standpoint and the policies I use. If you are using a broker, I'd also recommend running the question past them to get their view if it's their own specific policy or insurer. So I know it's a bit of a grey area and probably not answered completely, but that's the advice insurers are giving at present.
Okay, thank you.
Have you got anything on that, Ronan? Or
I think, well, just one moment. Yeah, I think it's, so can I just clarify the question? So it's so if the business has been told by the council to host an event effectively on their land, is that the?
So some of our members will hold leases on local authority land or licenses for their operations, so they'll be entirely based on local authority land, and their normal day-to-day operation would be there, so they would have volunteers or service users or just visitors, members of the public coming in for various sort of reasons and activities. They might also hold events there.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Yeah, even if it is on local council land, the fact that you are running the events gives you responsibility for maintaining health and safety on that site. So unfortunately, even if it is local authority land, there is still a requirement for you to ensure the health and safety, and obviously ensure that you've got these risk assessments and these measures in place to lessen the spread.
Okay, thank you. Another question now, and I think this will be common for a lot of members, just whether there's any specific advice around animal handling. So many of our members will have some animals on site and often be working with clients, some of whom might have additional needs around those animals as well.
It's a difficult question when it comes to animals. The reality is, I'm not a doctor. I haven't heard any evidence that there's any kind of spread between animals and humans. So I can't say that there needs to be any kind of, obviously there's no guidance for any kind of social distancing between humans and animals. I think that the risk you're more going to want to be looking at is, does the dealing with the animals risk bringing you within, does it cause you to breach social distancing guidelines? So for example, if more than one person has to handle an animal, does it mean that they're going to have to come within 2 meters? In which case, if that is the case, and you know that is going to be the case, are you going to have to introduce this 1 meter plus and bring in some other measure to mitigate the risks? Likewise, if you're going to have a situation where you need several people in a room at the same time as a result of handling animals, do you have sufficient ventilation? Are you going to make sure the people handling the animals aren't face to face, but they're more side by side? I think you need to look at it more from that perspective. I haven't seen any guidance in terms of actually, it being passed to animals or animals passing it on.
So you don't think members should be disinfecting goats between people stroking them and things like that then?
That's a very difficult one. I don't know what the science says in relation to whether or not it can be caught handling goats, unfortunately. I certainly haven't seen any guidance on that. No, I haven't seen any guidance on that.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of say it as a bit of a joke, but I guess, because animals in many cases with our members will be used as part of kind of therapeutic activities, and so handling them will be, a common occurrence. So yeah, I didn't know whether people should be kind of limiting that.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. If there are concerns about that, one thing could be introduced would be disposable gloves. If people are concerned about that, if they want to stroke the animals, then they can be given gloves or given the option of wearing gloves when they enter the site and then dispose of them afterwards. That's something that members may want to.
Just on that, there is the hand sanitization stations as well, and having that guidance on, washing your hands, however long it needs to be, and all that side of things also.
Okay, thanks. So another question, just around some of the things that are said in the HSE guidance around risk assessment. So somebody's asked around what a qualified person is classed as. Because sort of COVID-19 is such a complicated and complex subject, and there's lots of it's moving very quickly, are people within their own organisations considered to be qualified to be making the risk assessments? Is there a need to bring other people, other experts in, or what's the situation there?
That is a judgment that individual companies need to make themselves based on the requirements for their particular business. So, for example, if you've got a business of 4 or 5 people, and it's and in terms of health and safety, there's very little to worry about, and then you can have a nominated person who hasn't, who doesn't have, all the NEBOSH qualifications, etc. If you think that is sufficient to maintain the safety of that site, that is enough. So obviously that level of qualification wouldn't be suitable for British Gas or Shell or something like that. So depending on the nature of the business, the requirements go up and down for who is a qualified person. Certainly, you're going to want to have, if there are quite a few risks on your site, then the amount of qualifications from this qualified person is going to need to be higher. And I think it's always worth having someone with some form of qualifications, whether it be an EBOSH course or whatever. If not, if you don't have anyone with any kind of expertise whatsoever in HSE, then you may want to consider an outside firm. And there are quite a few companies out there that you pay a yearly premium, and they will carry out a few site inspections a year. They can provide some precedent documents that you can use to prepare risk assessments, etc. So you're going to need to show that you've at least got someone who is suitable, or you have access to a company that is suitable and that can provide you with that kind of advice. It's a bit wishy-washy, unfortunately, but a lot of health and safety law, unfortunately, is. A lot of it is applying common sense to your business.
Peter, just on that point, it's worth mentioning as well, as part of insurance policies, I mean, we've already mentioned the Rural Protect product and radar and the resources and help. There are other policies out there, legal expenses policies that provide document templates and resources. There are insurance products that have some resources within them. So it's always worth, again, checking with your broker, just double checking to see if you've got access to anything as part of your policy. It might not answer all your questions and be all things to all people, but it might help.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a question from someone who runs a community orchard and nature reserve. So that's open to the public, and they're not too worried about sort of crowding, not too many people go there, but they do run volunteer work parties. And so I think they're in England. So with regards to the specific guidance around kind of numbers of people who can gather, do they have to stick to a maximum of 6 volunteers within those work parties? Or if it's you know, an organised thing, are they able to have more so long as all the kind of restrictions around social distancing are followed?
Personally, I don't think there is any guidance on this on the HSE website. Personally, I would stick to the 6 people guidance if possible. I think if you stick to that, then I think you're generally in quite a safe place. Certainly for the time being, until the restrictions are lifted further.
I would agree. In the event of a claim, the insurer is going to be looking at what was done to comply with the advice. So if there was a claim, ideally a client is going to want that defended, but it's going to be more tricky to do that if the government advice wasn't adhered to or followed.
Okay, thank you. Another question around PPE. So if you have volunteers and service users, is there, and they request PPE, I think you might have covered this, is there an obligation for people to provide that if it's requested, or is it more on a sort of if it's required within HSE guidance?
Right. I can't sit here and say that it's absolutely, you absolutely have to do that. The HSE guidance says that if someone wants to wear face coverings, they should be encouraged to do so. However, I would be extremely reluctant if someone came to my business and said, look, I'd quite like to wear a face covering. I think if you're in a position where you start saying no, then I think you're leaving yourself very vulnerable. Because essentially, firstly, the person who you say cannot, wear the thing that they believe is going to make them more comfortable, there's a good chance they may go to a regulator, the HSE, and say, well, what's going on here? I wanted to make myself safe, and yet I was actually prevented from doing so. And that would set off alarm bells with the HSE. And also, it does go against the guidance if anyone does want to wear face coverings. They should be encouraged to do so. So you're going against the guidance, and also you're making yourself potentially vulnerable, I would say. and it sets a bad impression. You obviously want to make it clear you're doing everything you can to mitigate the risk, and if you stop someone who is looking to mitigate the risk from doing so, it wouldn't create a very good impression.
And so would the obligation be on that group to provide it, or is it adequate to just say you are able to wear that if you want to, like for example with a mask?
It depends. If normally I would expect the people coming to the site to bring it themselves. So if you had a situation whereby they told you in advance that they really wanted to wear face coverings and they felt it would make them feel safer, and if they specifically asked you to provide it, it might be preferable to do that. I don't think you're going to get many situations like that, though. I think more likely people are going to turn up with the face coverings and are just going to wear them anyway. So yeah, if someone specifically told you beforehand, look, just to let you know, we are planning on wearing face coverings, I don't think you need to go out and buy them in order to give them to them. I think that would just be noticed that they're intending to bring it themselves.
And conversely, I just thought, do you have any kind of recommendations around working with people who potentially like refuse to follow guidance and stuff like that? Would that be down to the individual kind of processes and procedures within that organisation to deal with that situation?
Yeah, anyone who is refusing to follow the measures you put in place to minimise the risk of the spread of COVID-19. Well, firstly, if they refuse to comply, then unfortunately, I think the only way around I see is to initiate disciplinary proceedings. And if they're flagrantly ignoring the advice, then I think you need to. Well, I'm not an employment lawyer, but you need to put measures in place to stop that from happening, whether that includes suspending them for a period just to make sure they're not breaching the measures put in place. But certainly you need to be able to demonstrate that you've done everything you can to minimise the risk. So if someone is heightening the risk, then you've got to be able to demonstrate that you've done everything to stop them from doing that. And I would assume it would that would need to be in the form of disciplinary action.
Just on that, Sophie, I would say if you do have a legal expenses insurance policy, or you have employment law or EPL cover, again, there will be helpline numbers. So, you can run that question and get some official advice on your specific situation. So if it's Road Protect, for example, call rradar, speak to an employment law specialist and get that advice.
I know that one of the things a number of our members have struggled with is potentially with some people that they're working with who may not be refusing, but may not understand the need to comply with those kind of new requests because they might have additional needs. And certainly in some circumstances, they have then had to take the decision to not allow those people onto site. So would you see that as sort of fitting within like the updated risk management policy?
Definitely, yeah. I think communication is important. I think the first step is to let them know why it's necessary, which I assume has happened in these cases. But if they refuse to comply, obviously, I don't think you can allow them on the site. And I think it's good to make a record of that as well. I think if you can keep a record of people you are denying access to the site and the reasons for it, again, that only serves to highlight the steps you are taking to minimise the risk, which can only be a good thing.
It is something that a lot of people have raised in other webinars. So I know that some of our care farming colleagues have covered it in some of the sessions that they've run, and we are looking to do a bit more on just helping people stay in touch with otherwise kind of vulnerable volunteers or service users who might not be able to access the site in the same way that they normally would do. So if that's something that you're kind of interested in, please keep in touch with us. I'm going to move on to another question. So we have one from Culpeper Community Garden. So they're a very small but intensively planted space. They are closed to the public at the moment and only allowing a limited number of people in under social distancing. But they are allowing plot holders, so they'll have it's like micro allotments, sort of small individual plot holders, to visit when there are no staff present. And they rely on them to exercise their own social distancing. Is that acceptable, and is there any kind of guidance around, I would guess, signage, things like that, that you would like to share?
Well, that's a difficult one. In all honesty, if once they're on your site, you're leaving yourself vulnerable. So I'd be reluctant to just let people attend your sites unsupervised. I think you'd want, at the very least, you're going to need very good instructions. You're going to need to give them very good instructions. Like I said, whether it's in the form of an email beforehand, a document you hand to them when they attend. They're going to need some kind of guidance as to what they need to do in order to follow the site rules, in order to minimize the risks. It's not simply a case of being able to say, well, you know, they've let themselves in, it's not our problem. It's still happening on your site, and you're still potentially liable under health and safety law. So I'd be cautious, very cautious, and I'd at least want to get some documentation to them outlining what they need to do to minimize the risks.
We've had some similar questions, Sophie, not just from Social Farm and Garden members, but for some local voluntary organisations who operate village allotments, where they're open to the public and they're not always site, manned by individuals. The advice from the government has been, families can obviously go out and garden as a family group. So this is a difficult situation because of that, because they're recommending or advising people can do this, going to tender allotment as part of their, previously part of the 1 hour a day exercise rule. Like Peter has been saying, it's communicating how the risk is managed on site and what they must adhere to. And although waivers, unfortunately don't really stand up in court a lot of the time, I think it demonstrates good risk management if the individuals, family members, whoever, can sign that document to say they've received it, they've read it, they've understood it, and will agree to adhere by those rules.
We ran a previous webinar with one of our members up in Manchester on adapting working practices, and they did share some of that, one of those agreement documents, which wasn't for that particular circumstance, but it was just around sort of updated working practices, and I believe that they did sign that to say that they were that they sort of read and understood it, and we have permission to share that. So if anybody would like to see that and hasn't received it through the previous webinar, please email me and I can send it out. In fact, I'll perhaps just attach that to the document that come out after this webinar. Okay. We have a question from someone in Glasgow, and the community that they're working with has suffered a number of losses of people due to COVID-19. And would that situation mean that they are considered at an increased risk that they should then bear in mind in their risk management? Is there particular guidance for projects who work in communities who have higher than average community infection rates? So I suppose for somebody working in Leicester, for example, as well.
Well, I think it's about managing the risk, isn't it? So if you've got a situation where you've had an unusually large number of workers, volunteers or visitors who have been contracting the virus, certainly I think it's common sense that you're going to want to put in place more stringent measures than a company that has either had no kind of COVID-19 or considers itself to be very low risk. Certainly the fact that they've had a lot of people contract the virus increases the chance of the HSE or a regulator paying attention to them, which increases the chances of a site visit, which means that they will want to be even more careful and be more in terms of the measures they've got in place, and moreover, the evidence they've got that they've done everything they can to minimise the risk. So essentially, there does appear to be a greater risk. Isn't that necessarily the case? It could have been a coincidence, and these workers and volunteers, whoever they are, could have picked it up in the general community. But certainly, I think you need to be taking that into account and potentially looking at whether or not your measures are stringent enough. But I think the important thing is to consider it and get some kind of evidence that you have considered it, and whether or not you can do anything else to minimise the risk, whether that be in a risk assessment, minutes of a meeting, whatever, so that if you do get that visit, you can say, look, we noticed this. We decided not to make a rradar report because we didn't have any information. There was no evidence that this had been caused by occupational exposure. And we considered doing this and this and this, and we did this and this, but we didn't do this because of this. That's the key.
Okay,
I hope that
thank you.
answers the question.
Yes, yeah, brilliant. Sorry, I was just going through the other questions.
Okay.
We've still got some coming in. Somebody manages a small area of woodland, and so they don't have access to running water, and so don't have hand washing facilities on site, and are asking if it's sufficient to provide gloves and hand sanitizer.
Well, I think you've got to then. You've got to. Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, you would be using running water and soap. But I think you've just got to do what you have to do to mitigate the risks. So yeah, I think the obvious way around that is hand sanitizer and gloves. Yes.
Okay, so it's really about showing that you've taken a sensible approach to the site that you have. There's no, and this is what we've been saying a lot with members, there isn't any one straightforward kind of set of rules. It's all about looking at your particular site.
Absolutely.
And making sure that you've taken the appropriate approach to risk. In some of our other webinars, members have been sharing, I've never used them, but they're called a tippy tap, and I think it's like a kind of portable tap. So if you do have the option to carry in a certain amount of water, that might be another option for hand washing. So I thought I'd just throw that out there. Okay. Another one as we're getting near the end. Does the panel envisage a time soon where we might be able to just allow the public to return? This is more of a sort of an opinion. So, you know, a lot of our members have really fantastic community events where people just come together and congregate and all of that. Do you think that this is all now kind of on hold basically until we have a vaccine? You know, do you have any views on that basically?
Well, yeah, again, it's not really a legal question. It's just, I mean, yeah, my view is, unfortunately, I think until we have a vaccine, probably yes. I think some form of restrictions probably will stay in place, but I wouldn't put my opinion above anyone else's, because it's obviously, I'm just going on what I've read in the papers and seen on the news. But certainly, unfortunately, it seems as though until we have a vaccine, these restrictions could stay in place for quite some time, some form of restrictions. And I think businesses need to go ahead on that basis, and they need to plan for the future on the basis that things aren't going to go back to normal for quite some time. That's my view anyway.
I kind of agree with that, Peter. I mean, it's an ever-moving situation where we're adapting sometimes from day to day to new things that are coming out. You know, COVID isn't going anywhere. We've obviously seen what's happened in Leicester in terms of a city being locked down in isolation. You know, we almost have to be prepared for that scenario at any point in time over the next 12 months, realistically. So it's just, I guess, when you're adapting your services or policies and procedures, although it's difficult, it's trying to remain adaptable to the potential changes.
I'm just going to my colleagues on the panel, and communicating with your, whether it's your service users, your volunteers and your staff, as the rules change, having that mechanism. So all the things we've talked about today, getting those communication channels, getting those new processes in place, so that when things do change again, because they are going to change again, hopefully for the good, you have that mechanism in place, you have that decision-making process, those checklists, those internal processes all there ready to flex when you need them.
Okay, thanks. And someone just commenting on, I guess because of all your backgrounds, you know, much of the conversation today is kind of about avoiding liability. And, you know, do you see a distinction between kind of actively avoiding being prosecuted and actually kind of caring for people and keeping people safe? You know, all of the members that we work with, you know, got huge amounts of heart, and it's quite difficult to talk about sometimes in these terms. So I just kind of wanted to sort of bring that up and address it, because fundamentally this is about keeping people safe and keeping the organisation safe.
From my, and this is more a personal point of view from the work that I do, I mean, I look after a lot of social care clients, domiciliary care agencies, care homes, as well as, you know, care farming community, working with vulnerable people. The line is very blurred at times when you're talking about protecting yourself from legal liability and looking after that individual. It's a very difficult line to walk sometimes. And I guess all we're trying to do at the panel is just provide information and guidance so informed decisions can be made, and that's all we can do in that situation. Obviously someone's well-being is paramount, but as long as we're aware of the risks and what we're getting into, and we can make informed decisions, that's the main thing from my point of view.
I think the two things go hand in hand. I don't think there's any reason they need to be mutually exclusive. I think health and safety law is essentially doing everything in your power that's reasonable to minimise the risk for workers and for visitors. So as long as you do everything you can to keep people safe, it goes hand in hand that you should be complying with health and safety law. I think where kind of liability becomes a bigger factor is being able to demonstrate and prove that you've done what you've done. I think that's the key. Anyone can sit back and say, oh yeah, well, I thought about doing this. Unless they see a document or some kind of proof that you've considered it and decided not to do it for such and such a reason and do this instead, I think that's when you get into problems in terms of liability. But really, I think that's a good way to approach it. Just think to yourself, am I doing everything I can to keep everyone as safe as possible, and can I prove that? And if you approach it from that perspective, you can't really go far wrong.
Again, I will, support what the others have said, and my background is risk and insurance, and you passionately care about the people who are involved in delivering the services, and want that business to remain strong and develop and grow. And some of the things we've talked about today are designed to do that. It's to help businesses solve the problems that they face, protect the people of the public and the people who are providing the services. And that's what we want to. We don't want to see claims coming through. We want to prevent them in the first place, and support those businesses to expand and develop what they passionately believe in.
I think that's right, Ronan. But the other thing is, when we do see a claim, we want to get the right outcome for you as the client as well. Which everything we've discussed today will assist and ensure in hopefully doing that.
Okay, thanks for all those contributions. I thought that was all the questions, but something else has just popped up. No, I think that's everything. Okay, I'm just going to run through some closing slides, but firstly, thank you so much for all of that. That's been incredibly helpful. So thanks to McClarrons and to Radar Legal for joining us.
Pleasure.
Was all right.
Thank you, Sophie, for putting it together.
Yeah.
It's been, I mean, obviously this has been at such a difficult time for so many members, and we've had so many kind of really quite complex questions, and there's a lot of anxiety and worry out there about, you know, keeping people safe. And so I think this is going to go a long way to just helping reassure people and helping them go back to providing the really amazing services that they provide. Because in England, at least, some of the lockdown restrictions are changing at the weekend, and so we do have another webinar coming up tomorrow, which is going to be going through more of a general checklist, specifically aimed at city farms and community gardens, and that's at 2 o'clock. And then on the 14th of July, we also have a similar webinar which is aimed at care farms. And please just keep in touch with the website, and you'll be able to see those as and when they are they're recorded and they go up. Okay, right, I think that's nearly us. The last thing I wanted to just mention is that we are really encouraging members to support one another. So one of the things that we have done is kind of revamped and relaunched our Social Farms and Gardens Facebook group. We've had a lot of people joining that over the last month, and lots of conversations about a lot to do with some of the issues that we've been talking about today. So particular approaches to health and safety, and just anything, you know, anything to do with the whole vast Social Farms and Gardens world. So if you haven't joined that group, please do, and please sort of speak to other members and share ideas. It's a very friendly place. Okay, well, that's us then. I'm going to press stop recording soon, so this will go up on the website. So thanks again for joining us. Thanks to McClarrons and thanks to Radar, and keep in touch with us. And if you've got any questions following this, I will be sending out all the slides, so you can just reply to that email and ask me if you've got any follow-up questions. So thanks very much, everybody. Bye.